Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining ScotWeek's podcast. We're so excited to have one of our favorite people on today, Dan Rutstein, and also the beautiful Kelsey Deanne of ScotWeek. Kelsey, tell us about our podcast today.
First, I want to say you are Cindi McIntosh, the president of ScotWeek. So excited to tag team with this wonderful woman. But yes, Dan Rutstein. Oh my goodness. So you have this podcast, US of Dramerica, and it is fantastic. But before we get into that, tell us about how you got into whiskey, because you have been doing whiskey diplomacy. So tell us about that.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on. With all that's going on in the world, it's very nice to sit down and drink whiskey with interesting people. This is sort of the whole point of my podcast, but also it's just something I like to do. So I'm delighted to be on. So my whiskey story is maybe not dissimilar to other people. I'm going to go right back to basics on this. So as a youngster, drinking very cheap whiskey while at university, I got a little bit carried away one night and I was very ill. And just the smell of whiskey for the next 10 years made me feel sick. And I was a journalist in those days, and I actually did some distillery tours where I had to turn down the free samples because I wasn't a whiskey drinker and it made me feel ill. And then I changed careers from journalism to the British government, and I got offered my first diplomatic posting as Deputy Consul General in Dusseldorf in Germany. And the Consul General, a wonderful gentleman called Malcolm Scott, was Scottish. And I knew that I'd have to drink whiskey as part of my work. So a friend of my wife's was a bit of a whiskey collector, a chap called Dave Brown from Bermuda, and he trained me on a holiday there to drink whiskey. We started off on very light whiskies with lots of water in them, and then we got better and better at this. And then I took up my posting, and my first night in the job, we hosted a huge reception at the Consul General's residence in Dusseldorf. All the guests went home. The boss sat down with me, pulled out a bottle of Glenfiddich 12, and we sat down and we drank nearly the whole bottle. And fortunately, I'd prepared for this moment. And that's when I sort of really began enjoying whiskey. And then over the 8 years I was a diplomat, I probably hosted somewhere between 30 and 40 whiskey tastings. And we used it, as you say, for something called whiskey diplomacy. So we were trying to promote Britain and Britain's values around the world. And a great way of doing that is pulling people together, getting them together over a glass of whiskey, and all sorts of extraordinary people would come and join us for these events. We'd have a whiskey, we'd talk about what we wanted to talk about on behalf of the British government and enjoyed the whiskey. And I enjoyed that enormously. And then when I left government, I thought, I want to keep drinking whiskey, and that's how I started the podcast.
That's amazing. I love that story. And it is a true thing. You can sit down with a bottle of scotch pretty much with almost anyone who enjoys scotch, but also enjoys alcohol. And I have found in business relationships that it smooths everything over. So I love this diplomacy. I'm going to use this moving forward. So you talked about Glenfiddich. Can you tell us a little bit about some of and I know it's difficult to try to sort of say that one's more of a favorite than the other. Do you have maybe a go-to whiskey that's a daily whiskey, and then one that you maybe have for special occasions?
So it's an interesting thing about whiskey. As you say, it sort of is used for what a friend of mine describes as big talk. And you can have, real conversations over a glass of whiskey. And I think something very special about drinking scotch, and I can't quite, now I do the podcast and I do it so often, but there was a time when I can almost remember sort of where I was and who I was with and what we were drinking. So I sort of think back on conversations I have with friends, and I can say, oh, do you remember that night we were drinking an Oban 14 and we talked about this? You can be very specific with those sort of things. So for me, it's all about sort of memories and friendships as much as it is the actual sort of liquid itself. But I think probably my daily sipper is, and actually it links back to a memory. One of my favourite whiskey tastings I think I ever did, this was sort of probably the pinnacle of whiskey diplomacy, was when I was based in Germany. We did a whiskey tasting on a warship. So there's one ship in the Royal Navy fleet which was christened with a bottle of whiskey and not the traditional champagne that they break over the bow. And it's this ship, HMS Sutherland, and it was in Hamburg on manoeuvres, and we did an event on board where we brought a load of senior German businessmen and politicians together. We sat down with the crew, the senior crew, all in their kilts, and we drunk a full range of whiskies. And then we went down to the torpedo room. Fortunately, nobody was allowed to press any buttons. And it was the most extraordinary night. But actually, that was the first night I'd ever drunk Cardew, which was part of the Diageo family. And Cardew became my regular drinker. So I've always got a bottle of it. And if I need an easy drink at the end of the night, that's the one that I will pull out. For my special whiskey, I think, again, some of it comes back to memories. When I was in Germany, we worked very closely with Diageo. When I was posted here in America, in Los Angeles, we did a lot of work with William Grant whiskies. We did a lot of work with Balvenie and Glenfiddich. And so I started drinking lots of Balvenie, and we did some extraordinary tastings. So you will have been to the usual tastings where you maybe have 4 or 5 whiskies. And I've been to the Balvenie ones where you go sort of 12, 14, 17. But I remember doing a dinner where we started on the high numbers. We did 17, 21, ton 1509, 30, and then 40. And so when you're going, up there, you start having extraordinary whiskies. I did a podcast the other day with the new luxury whiskey man for the West Coast, David Laird, who I know you both know well, and he sent me a bottle of Balvenie 21 so I can have a proper conversation with him over Zoom, and that's now my special. I've had a long day. I need to sit in my garden. And until somebody gives me the Balvenie 50 as a whole bottle, I'll have to make do with the 21, which is no bad drink, of course.
Oh, no, we actually tried the 40. What did you think of that, Kelsey?
Oh my gosh, yes. So for ScotWeek, we do Whiskey Wednesdays, and Cindi flew into Texas to visit me in Fort Worth. And we went to this really cool speakeasy pub, and they had a Balvenie 40. And oh my gosh, it was almost as good as a romantic encounter. It was delicious.
You should be a diplomat with a turn of phrase like that. But
I have to say, it knocked our socks off, only we weren't wearing any. It was very good.
I've been lucky enough. I've had Balvenie 50 3 times, and it's almost beyond whiskey. It's such a completely different flavour to a traditional whiskey. Even the 40, I compare it to. I play golf badly, and I remember once when I was a journalist covering a professional golf tournament, and you see the professionals and the way they hit the ball and the noise it makes. It's like it's not the same sport to the one you've been playing. And I think that's the thing for Balvenie 50. It's almost not a normal whiskey because it's such a different flavour. But the most extraordinary thing, and you will know this a bit because obviously you're in this whiskey world, is the more you do of these sorts of things, events and so on, the more you start drinking very nice whiskies, but often not from full bottles, because that's not really how it works. There's lots of samples. And I find almost the better the whiskey, the worse the vessel they give it to you in. So when I tried Balvenie 50 the first time, the guy pulled it out of his bag, and it was almost like the sort of bottles they use for urine samples, and not a dissimilar colour. And yet in this thing was, it's a $38,000 bottle. So there was probably $500, maybe $1,000 worth of whiskey in basically a sort of sample vial. And it's this weird thing where the liquid's so good you don't mind how it comes, but it's quite odd seeing good whiskies in terrible presentation.
Does the plastic affect the flavor? When you pour it into a container like that, will the plastic affect the flavor?
No, I mean, I don't know how long it was in the plastic for. I think only to get it from his house where he's probably got a real bottle to wherever we were. But no, it doesn't. It doesn't affect it at all. I mean, I'm actually going to pour myself out a bottle in a moment. But so I've got, again, some whiskey that was given to me as a sample. So this is a Dalmore Portwood, which is a great whiskey. It's not an age statement, but it's somewhere in the 20s. And in what looks, could be olive oil, could be medicine. but that's the bottle I've got it in because that's the sample bottle. So if you don't mind, I'm going to pour myself a small dram because that's what I like to do.
Do you have some whiskey with you, Kelsey?
Oh my goodness.
I'm not sure what this is, to be honest.
It's a lovely decanter.
I mean, I'm in Ken Mish's TV room, and this is just sitting here because there's scotch all over his whole house. So I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah, Ken Mish knows his scotch. She has a very good taste. I'm sure it's something delicious. But no, I do not have any whiskey at the moment, unfortunately. It's a very sad moment.
Share with you.
I know. But Dan, so tell us how, so we finished up with Germany, had whiskey diplomacy, and then how did you get to LA, and what was the whiskey scene like in LA for you?
Yeah, so my posting finished in Germany. I started looking for my next job, and I was very fortunate that a role came up in Los Angeles as part of the US network. So I was responsible for inward investment, so encouraging American companies to invest in the UK, and I was responsible for I think 4 teams across 32 states of America that I sort of looked after with all my colleagues, and it was great because, you know, the sort of whiskey diplomacy principle of can you get interesting people together over a whiskey applies just as strongly here as it does in Germany, obviously. And America is the largest export market for Scotch. I remember if you take all the whiskey that's exported to America every year and laid all the bottles from head to toe, they'd reach from Edinburgh to New York. So there's a serious amount of whiskey that's drunk over here, and people love it. And it was great. I travelled all over my side of the country doing whiskey tasting. So I did loads in LA, was doing them in Denver and Seattle and San Francisco. Some in Utah, you know, it was great. We went all over the place, and people love it. And I think Americans, and you know this obviously what ScotWeek's all about, but also what, you know, your podcast is about as well. Americans love it. They love the stories, they love the history, and obviously those lucky enough to love the visits where they can go and drink whiskey and play golf and go hunting and all the stuff that you can do in Scotland. So, you know, people are very amenable to whiskey diplomacy and whiskey in general in this part of the world.
That's pretty cool. And, you know, especially because it's been the pandemic right now, you know, and it's kind of dragging on and on for everyone. I think it's so important that we indulge ourselves, if even just a little, you know, as we get through this. I don't know if we should call it self-medicating or just a little bit of an enjoyment, but I'm finding more and more whiskeys and enjoying them and trying them than I ever probably would have before. Have you noticed that other people are doing the same? Our whiskey sales just amazing? Yeah,
100%. So on a personal level, obviously I've got a lot of whiskey drinking friends, and we've been doing quite a sort of conservative version of managing COVID. So I haven't been to a bar or restaurant since March. I've only been to a shop once. So I'm doing a lot of Zoom stuff, and there's been plenty of, you know, Zoom happy hours where I've opened up whiskey. We've done a little bit of garden stuff. So, you know, I went around somebody else's house and sat, you know, decent distance apart across their fire pit and drunk a beautiful whiskey. So, you know, I'm trying to be sort of whiskey social, even though I'm not doing it in the places I used to. But on the podcast, part of the reason I started the podcast originally is I wanted an excuse, even when I wasn't working for the government anymore, to drink whiskey with interesting people and have interesting conversations. And when COVID happened and we all got stuck in our houses, I increased the frequency from every 2 weeks to every week. And guess what? Easy to get hold of, because the people who've been avoiding me because they're on film sets and all the things that people are doing, I suddenly knew that they were at home and they had nowhere to go. So when I said, when are you free for the podcast? They had no excuses. So I managed to get some great guests on, and we've had some real conversations. I thought I was going to be hosting a sort of comedy podcast with a tinge of seriousness, but certainly since March, we've sat down and had really interesting conversations with people. So we've talked about, the future of travel, the future of filmmaking. We've done social justice, diversity, women in sport, racism. We've covered all these different areas, and it's just, you have a whiskey, you have a conversation, and I think whiskey aids conversation, and people do want to have conversations at the moment. I think it's been, for me, the podcast, apart from the sort of production part of it, just on a personal level, it's been a great excuse to have real conversations with people. It's like my midlife crisis, but it's cheaper and less dangerous than buying a motorbike or having an affair. And this is the thing I'm doing instead.
I love it. It brings to mind too, I'll just talk a little bit about this real quick, if you'll both indulge me. I'm so sorry, but it also brings to mind the true story that I don't know if a lot of people are aware of, but during World War II, the tiny Scottish island of, is it Tade? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Tade, I always butcher the Scots names of things. But the tiny island off the coast of Scotland ran out of whiskey, and there was a freighter that was full of 50,000 cases of whiskey bound for the United States that actually ran aground off the coast of this island. It was known as the SS Cabinet Minister. And in heavy fog, it ran aground. And somebody caught wind on the island that there were 50,000 cases of whiskey on board of this freighter. And so they go through this process of, getting it. They had to wait till the Sabbath was over because, they're very, very religious on the islands. They were back in this day as well. And so they just kind of watched it, hoping that it didn't sink until Monday morning when they could actually get their boats out there and offload all this whiskey. And then they hid it in a cave, and then people from the government came to try to find it. And it's a true story. And they made it into a delightful movie called Whiskey Galore. Don't know if you've heard of it, but everyone should watch.
There was one, I think they made in the 30s or 40s, and then there's a remake that came out, 10 years ago? 10, 15 years ago? Yeah.
So kind of reminds me, that was a wartime, and this isn't any fun for anyone, but it's a great fun watch, about running out of whiskey in a time of life when you really need it the most.
Yeah, I think that's, I'm quite lucky, I think, at the moment. So as you probably know, in terms of the whiskey industry, it was suffering because of the tariffs that are on Scotch exports here. But also, obviously, on-premise is almost completely shut. So, whiskey sales are down on that side of it, but it's been more than made up for with people drinking at home. And I've talked to lots of people in the whiskey business, and people are changing how they're drinking now, because if you go to a bar and you want to drink a good whiskey, depending on where you are, you're looking at, in LA, it could be $15, $20 for pretty much any whiskey, maybe slightly cheaper in Texas. But, your money doesn't go very far drinking good whiskey in a bar. But at home, suddenly, $50 for a bottle of whiskey, $70, $100 becomes a lot more accessible. So people are changing their habits. And I know people are thinking, well, when life goes back to normal, actually having friends round in the garden to, have takeout and drink expensive whiskey, maybe they'll keep doing that even when they can go back to some bars and restaurants. I think it'll be really interesting to see how whiskey drinking changes. I know, but people are enjoying their food and drink much more at the moment, because it's one of the few pleasures that you can have, and you can concentrate on something and not think about the world around you.
One of your partners in US of Dramerica, your podcast, is I have trouble pronouncing names. Chris Cussiter, is that how you say his last name? Okay. And he is a former Scotland team rugby captain, and now he's based in Los Angeles and has his own whiskey distribution store. And also his wife is absolutely stunning. She's former Miss Scotland, isn't she?
She was runner-up in Miss Scotland, but she won't mind you saying that she was the winner.
Okay, well, she's the winner in my heart because she's so lovely and she's stunning. So, oh my gosh, Sarah, yes, go Sarah. But tell me about how you and Chris came together. What is that partnership like?
Yeah, so it's interesting actually. So another mutual friend of ours, the wonderful Lorne Cousin, who is famous for being both the various times ambassador for all sorts of brands as part of William Grant, but also being Madonna's bagpipe player on her world tour. He introduced me to Chris Cussiter. So Chris played played rugby for Scotland more than 70 times, then moved out here to move into the whiskey business. When he was moving here, Lorne thought we should meet. So we met at Soho House in West Hollywood, and that's where Lorne, that was the first time I had Balvenie 50. So Lorne poured out his urine sample vial of Balvenie 50 and poured a wee dram for Chris and I. So we were bonded by whiskey the first time we met, and we became good friends. And when we started the podcast, the first 4 episodes, we were joint hosts. And then after that, he was so busy with work because he's doing a great trade running a whiskey store in California and an online business. He just didn't have time to podcast anymore. So he's a supporter of the podcast, and I get all my whiskey from him. But he co-hosted the first few episodes and has introduced me to some of our guests. And I had a guy on the other day, a former teammate of his, another former Scotland player who's now retired from rugby. COVID ended his career early, and he's working for Glenturret Whisky. So there's a lot of links between former Scottish rugby players and whiskey. So it's been, great drinking whiskey and sharing whiskey stories with Chris, who, he's not sort of famous in America because people don't watch rugby, but he's definitely famous in Scotland.
Did you say he works for Glenturret, the distillery?
Yeah. So Rory Jackson, he was on the podcast last week. He's now part of Glenturret, who are doing a whole rebrand with beautiful new bottles.
Well, Hans-Georg Wyss is a dear friend of myself and Kelsey's. We've gone out to his winery, Halter Ranch, here on the West Coast, and he's part owner of Glenturret. So we're anxious to get over there and tour that distillery.
Yeah, well, it's the oldest working distillery in Scotland, they say. And obviously, I think a few distilleries have claimed that, but when they've got real historians with actual proof that they are the oldest working distillery in Scotland, and they do everything by hand. It says nothing by computer, so it's all the measurements, all the mashing, it's all done by hand. So he was telling me it's going to be quite a place to visit when you can.
I can't wait. And I just found out what this is. Glenmorangie Nectar de Pro.
Wow, very nice.
Quite nice. So, Kelsey, here's to you.
Oh, thank you.
For you.
Thank you. My sober Texas self. Thank you. Enjoy. But speaking of Glenturret and their new, not new, but the distillery, whenever we can get over and tour it. But are there any other distilleries that you're really, really excited to go see once everything gets back to a quote unquote new normal?
Yeah, it's funny. I've been thinking a lot, like everyone, because I've got so much time on my hands, to think about when life returns to normal, what things do I want to do more of, and what things am I not too fussed about doing as much. And I think, and I know, Kelsey, I met you at lots of these things. There were lots of receptions. There's this world of receptions. Some of them are amazing, but there was a lot of things we went to because you were meant to go to them. And I'm not sure I miss sort of standing in a room with 150 random people eating not always wonderful food and saying hello to people who you don't necessarily want to always talk to so regularly. Like, I don't miss that. But then there are other things I absolutely miss. And my sort of top 3 in no particular order are live sport, casinos, and distilleries, and wineries in brackets, but mostly distilleries. And I think, when life returns to normal, and it may well be I have to do the Kentucky Bourbon Trail first because transatlantic travel will take longer to return. But there's something, and you both know this, there's something about a distillery and a visit around the distillery. And it's not just the sort of whiskey samples at the end. It's it's the smell, it's the taste, it's the people. I just love that environment. And I can't wait to go back and do a trip to Scotland. And it's actually a great shame for me. I feel like, considering how much whiskey's been part of my sort of working life for the last 10 years or so, I've not been to as many distilleries as I should, just because when I used to go to Scotland with work, it wasn't whiskey work. It was, more commercial work. So I did manage some distilleries. So I remember I had meetings in Glasgow and had 4-hour gap between a morning meeting and an afternoon meeting. And I sort of Googled what's the nearest distillery to Glasgow, and I managed to nip out to McIntosh because you can get there and back in just under an hour. So that was great, but I haven't actually done the proper touring distilleries holiday that I've always wanted to do, just because I didn't have time with work. When I've got a family and it's hard to say, hey guys, do you mind if I just disappear off to sort of wander around Scotland drinking whiskey for 2 weeks? So I haven't done as much as I want to, so I'm desperate to go. And because I know so many whiskey people who keep saying, I'll give you the VIP tour, I want to have the behind the scenes VIP tour. And I think, I want to go to Jura, I want to go Balvenie, I want to go to Glenturret now. But I'd love to do it properly. Almost the way the Americans I've met have done it. I want to go, do it over a month, take my golf clubs and do a proper golf and whiskey and good food and cold weather and wind as well with friends. I really would love to do that. And it might be 2-3 years before you could do that, but it will be on the list. And I can dream about it after sitting in my California garden drinking a whiskey. I close my eyes and think what it would be like to visit a distillery in Scotland sometime soon.
Oh my goodness. And I'm missing Scotland so much right now as well. And especially, and I know I pronounce this 2 different ways. I'm not sure what's correct, but Tomatin or Tomatin, I'm not sure the correct, but that's most closest to my family home. I love that distillery. That's an excellent Scotch. If anybody's ever been, it's near the Culloden battlefield, actually, not too far away. And then also Highland Park in Kirkwall out on the Orkneys, amazing distillery, Oban. Gosh, Balvenie is in the Cairngorms. It's just amazing. I like to, whenever I'm somewhere in Scotland and visiting a town, and I like to travel overland a lot in Scotland, and I'll just look up whatever the nearby distillery is, and that can be great fun, just to, hey, there's this distillery, let's go over and visit it for the afternoon. But they're so delightful, and if anybody who's watching hasn't already been to Scotland or doesn't go, I mean, it's kind of a fun thing to do. I think sometimes it's daunting because how many distilleries are there now? Last I understood it was about 124 distilleries, and then I don't know, there were like 8 more in the works, and then some are kind of closing shop right now. So I'm not even sure what those numbers are.
Yeah, the numbers always slightly vary. There's a little bit of a myth to some of this, but it's depending on who you ask and how much they've had to drink. It's somewhere between 120 and 150, I think. So yeah. So ladies, tell me about your drinking during lockdown. Are you drinking more, differently, less? How are you doing your whiskey during a global pandemic?
Go ahead, Kelsey.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I feel like it goes in spurts, and I'm kind of like you, Dan. I really enjoy drinking with friends and for social occasions, and I can remember drinking certain things and having certain conversations with people. So I will never forget drinking that Balvenie 40 with Cindi in Fort Worth. Yeah, so and I've gotten to, because I've been spending more times with friends in their homes, exploring their liquor cabinets, I've been able to try some very nice things. So I had my first Balvenie 21, that was nice, at someone's home, and then being in Texas, exploring a little bit more of the southern bourbons. So Balcones, they have a award-winning single malt whiskey, and that's out of Waco, Texas. where my brother went to university at Baylor. So that's been a really fun thing to do. But other than that, it's been kind of low key. I've been really, this year, especially lately, I've been really trying to stay healthy and get into shape. The film industry is opening up, so just trying to, get camera ready, so to speak. But what about you, Cindi?
Well, yeah, we've enjoyed a lot of fine whiskeys together. I was so happy we started Whiskey Wednesdays live at 5. We always talk about this, but it's like when ScotWeek, couldn't have our events in April, we very quickly jumped onto some social media platforms and doing some virtual things just to try to keep people interested. And we were tracking, what people responded to the most. And I think what people were really responding to the most was anything we posted about whiskey, anything and everything. So we kind of launched down that road with our Whiskey Wednesdays live at 5, sometimes 5:30. but it's been really fun. And like Dan was talking about a little bit earlier, it's actually way more affordable to do it this way, because we're not like in a bar like buying shots. We're actually getting, we're getting the bottles most of the time and bringing that home and sharing it with people. It's been a lot of fun. And yes, but I've had a lot more alcohol, I want to say, than normal, maybe. Just because, we are normally out doing, all types of performances and all these different events that we do annually every single month, every single week of our lives. So that's kind of missing, but it's been fun. And I've learned more about Scotch, I think, this year than ever. And thanks to people like yourself, Dan, who are willing to come on and talk to us and teach us a little bit more about Scotch. And it's been wildly fun. I'm enjoying it.
Well, Dan, are there any podcast episodes that are upcoming that you're really excited about? And also tell us where we can listen to your podcast.
So United States of Dramerica, we're on all of the platforms. I think it's interesting. So people say to me, do you have a favorite guest? And I think as an ex-diplomat, I find it hard to single out a particular episode. I want to keep it sort of neutral. I mean, I've had some wonderful guests. I think it's interesting. If you look through our guests, I think what makes it so much fun for me to make is the variety. So the common denominator, the only bar to entry to be on my podcast is you have to like whiskey and you have to be interesting. And that opens up a whole world. So we've had everyone from, we've shared guests with you. We've had the amazing Daniel B. We've had the even more amazing and beautiful Ross King on the show. But, we've had a British fighter pilot. We've had TV producers.
Well, thank you, Dan, so much for joining us for our podcast this week for ScotWeek. And you can find Dan's podcast at usofdramerica.com, and you can find it on all the podcast channels. So thank you, and don't forget to follow ScotWeek on YouTube, Podbeam, and iTunes.